How will Russia's war in Ukraine come to an end? And what happens to Russia afterwards? It seems like there are three major scenarios for post-war Russia: victory, defeat, and concession. But among these three scenarios, there are many different outcomes. Join us as we look at all the possible scenarios for post-war Russia. US strategy and past scenarios. The current US strategy in the Ukrainian proxy war could lead to a scenario that you might not expect. This scenario could happen regardless of what path Russia takes, and it's based on Russia's past defeats. Biden's strategy has been based on the Reagan plans back in the 1980s. Reagan broke from past presidents by escalating tensions with the Soviet Union. Reagan's doctrine was based on a three-pronged attack. The first goal was to increase US military might, which would force the USSR to spend more as well. The US would also try to sanction and reduce the value of USSR's exports to weaken the value of their currency, and block access to high-tech imports, which would force the USSR to expend their own resources instead. Reagan's plan worked, but since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia rebounded with huge energy exports. Biden's strategy is already having a similar effect to Reagan's over a much shorter time window. Prior to the war, Russia had a strong export economy, but sanctions have dealt heavy blows to Russia's income. Domestic revenue has also dropped as more citizens are conscripted, which leaves less workers and less spenders to prop up the economy. America's aggressive spending on military aid to Ukraine has forced Russia to overspend in response. But this strategy is a dangerous bet that amounts to a war of attrition. Even as Russia gets weaker, the US economy might also suffer. Reagan's strategy worked in the 80s, but it also raised the US public debt to the highest level since the end of World War II, when calculated as a percentage of GDP. Regardless of the scenario for post-war Russia, the current strategy is a double-edged sword since current debt levels are already at an all-time high. This strategy could lead to the first post-war scenario for Russia. If the war drags on with no true victory, Russia will suffer, but so will the rest of the world. The World Bank and other large financial institutions have warned that a war of attrition will lower the standard of living for most of the world. Meanwhile, China will remain largely untouched. In the case of a stalemate, China emerges the victor. Russia's defeat could mirror the past. So why is Biden using this strategy if it has such harsh byproducts? Because historians agree that Reagan's plan was vital to the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's a 1-2 punch, hitting the internal economy and forcing excess spending on military costs. Should this plan work out the way the Pentagon envisions, Russia would experience its first true post-war scenario: total defeat. Historians have also noted patterns in Russia's history. Military defeats have consistently led to extreme shifts in Russia's government. In 1598, Russia collapsed following a nearly 30-year war dubbed the Livonian War. The Tsardom lost and seceded Estonia to Sweden. Following the death of Fyodor I shortly afterwards, Russia descended into crisis during the Time of Troubles for roughly 15 years before re-stabilizing. When Russia lost to Japan during World War I, large-scale protests sundered St. Petersburg and crippled the House of Romanov, which had ruled for over 300 years. If the US can help force a defeat in Ukraine, while also crippling Russia's economy, significant change could take place. In such a scenario, Russian-controlled territories could also push for independence. These include territories like South Ossetia, which was part of Georgia, and the Kuril Islands. Even Russian-backed countries like Sudan, Syria, and Egypt could rise up to reject Russian influence and take back their land. If uprisings were successful, Russia could be overthrown, ushering in a new era of democracy and peace. However, even in the event of partial or total governmental collapse, it seems likely that the Russian government could be reshaped. While Russia has a history of shifting after defeat, not all of these shifts have been for the better. In 1917, following the war with Germany, the Bolshevik Revolution became the turning point that would lead to the start of communism. At the time, it seemed like Russia had been splintered beyond repair, with 20 different governments claiming control over different parts of the Russian Empire. However, Russia's nefarious politicians seized the opportunity in the chaos and built the foundations of the war machine that sparked this whole crisis to begin with. If the wrong people pick up the pieces with false promises, Russia's defeat could bear an even more tyrannical leader in the decades to come. To play devil's advocate with the first defeat scenario, the current regime has one thing that former Russian governments lack: information. With information technology, a powerful propaganda campaign, and surveillance, it's possible for the current Russian government to squash any ideas of revolution before they take hold. In this scenario, Russia loses, becomes increasingly isolated from the rest of the world, and the Russian people suffer under harsh working conditions, while the Russian government claws back financial gains at the cost of the Russian people. This scenario is supported by history as well. While Russia has undergone many cycles of military losses followed by unrest, the autocracy of the Russian government has remained mostly unchanged. This command structure gives total control to the people in charge, and leaders have no consequences for their wrongdoing or failures. While the people of Russia might have some power to fight against the Putin regime, it's more likely that his removal will come at the hands of another autocratic ruler scheming to replace him. In that event, failure in Ukraine might cause change, but it will only be temporary. If this scenario happens, then Russia will most likely become another North Korea, posturing with nuclear and military rhetoric, oppressing their citizens and isolating themselves from the world with increased border security. It would usher in an end to the fighting, but the world would remain on a knife's edge with peace out of the question. But even Putin's extreme tactics for controlling the narrative could also backfire. The more he pines for the years of the USSR, the more he may be inadvertently creating the same outcome that led to its defeat. As a KGB foreign intelligence officer, Putin felt a deep sense of betrayal at the changes and losses Russia faced at the end of the Cold War. He's been working with information so long, he might have tricked himself into believing his own lies. But deep down, Putin's failure to accept both historical change and Russia's losses amounts to fear. Without barriers in place to prevent his abuse of power, if he spirals mentally, the strong machine of the Russian government could unravel. If the Russian military turns on the top brass like Germany's army in 1917, then that could pave the way for change. It could also open the door to Ukrainian offensives, pushing deeper into Russian territory to aid in a coup. If Putin, or any other autocratic so-called president, is unable to quell the rising unrest following a defeat, it's likely Russia's economic footholds would break down. This scenario would further cripple the Russian government by disrupting oil and gas export routes and illicit sources of income like the mines they control in the Middle East and Africa. If revolution happens, governmental institutions like healthcare and banking sectors would struggle to survive, which would have deadly consequences for the Russian people. But this scenario could still be better than a tightened grip. The dreaded Russian victory. At the start of the conflict, it seemed like Ukraine would be doomed to fall. Russia's military might has been the stuff of legends, defeating the German advance, infiltrating, assassinating targets, and stealing top-secret information across the world, and causing the largest arms race in history with the US. For decades, the US and Russia have been enemies. For decades, a new and hybrid war has waged over the freedoms espoused by the US government and the autocratic ideals of Russia. But Russia didn't easily defeat Ukraine. They've been pushed back, forced to use inhumane tactics to strike fear into the hearts of Ukraine and the rest of the world, while their defeats pile up. If Russia wins through pure attrition, they will rule over a desolated Ukraine. It's clear the Ukrainian people won't give in to the demands of Putin, and they will fight until nothing is left. Russia will have access to vast farmlands that they can use to rebuild their internal economy in spite of sanctions. That is, if Ukraine doesn't make the ground unusable. Poisons and other waste could render Ukraine's vast expanses unusable, removing one of the only silver linings if Russia wins. If they win, the government will undoubtedly carry out more genocide by destroying Ukrainian culture. But this isn't a victory that has any tangible value. If anything, it will only cause more rifts between Russian citizens who have family and ties to Ukraine and who don't buy the propaganda. A victory would give little other resources since infrastructure is already damaged beyond usability, and it would cost billions of dollars that Russia doesn't have to rebuild it. Russia would expand its borders and Ukrainians would endure more suffering, but little would be gained in the short term. The real problem with victory lies in the future, possibly even beyond Putin. If the current Russian regime remains in power following a victory, it's clear that the plan to rebuild the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics would inform Russian policy for decades to come. Russia would try to rebuild in spite of sanctions and bide their time until they could attack their next target and bring more territory into the fold. In such a scenario, it's possible that the world could unite against them. Even their long-standing allies like China have expressed disinterest in further support for Russia. So it's possible that a victory could actually cause the noose to tighten instead. Either way, it's a scenario only those on Putin's payroll really want. Near certainties and concessions. In all scenarios, Russia will need to overcome huge obstacles. One of Russia's key objectives with Ukraine is aimed at preventing NATO expansion from threatening Russia's borders. However, regardless of the outcome, it seems likely that Russia's aggression will have the opposite effect. As of this year, Finland, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, Ukraine and Sweden have all submitted formal bids to join NATO. Finland, Sweden, Bosnia and Herzegovina have already entered the process of accession. It's clear that Russia would easily fall into a full-scale NATO assault. However, if Russia engages in nuclear war with NATO, this scenario would spell doom for the whole planet. Another dreadful scenario ends in a conference that sees Ukraine conceding portions of land to Russia to halt the war. This scenario would end similarly to a defeat with no regime change, as the border would be heated for the rest of our lives. Russian war criminals would face virtually no consequences. Russian warmongers would feel emboldened to try again with other countries if they can rebound their economy. In exchange for a ceasefire, Russia would also demand NATO halt military expansion, and they would want NATO to agree to stop accepting new members. This would only give Russia free rein to attack non-member nations at a time and place of their choosing, as Putin's imperialist ideals further upset the global prosperity we've had since the end of the Cold War. There are many scenarios to end the war in Ukraine. Which do you think will pan out? Let us know in the comments section. Subscribe to the channel to catch more news coming your way soon.